right. Hello, and welcome to the final session of Introduction to Children's Science Podcasting. So, this is the fourth out of four, and it's really the cap to everything we've learned, in which we finally get to discuss all of your questions together as a Tumble Media team. So, over the past three sessions, it's been mostly me talking, along with a pre-recorded interview with a special guest. And that's been a good way to get out a lot of like core lessons of children's science podcasting. But I also think that, having a discussion, especially with, in terms of what does it take to make a children's science podcast and do it for a long time? I think I couldn't think of anybody better to discuss this with than my partners at Tumble Media, Marshall Escamilla and Sara Robberson Lentz. So I'm going to have them introduce themselves in just a little bit, but I also wanted to let you know that you can watch all of the previous sessions on our YouTube page at Tumble Science Podcast for Kids, and I've organized it into a handy playlist that you can just put on and let run while you're doing chores around the house and catch up with. It's going to be 4 hours of learning about children's science podcasts. And we've covered a lot from why you should be excited about STEM podcasts for kids, actually getting down to writing science about science for the kids' ear. But still, this is just an introduction. And even in 4 hours, we could not hope to cover all that it takes to make a kids' podcast. So I thought that, we've spent, I think it's been like 10 years almost at this point, working together to create not only Tumble Science Podcast for Kids, but a company that's managed to sustain it and for us all to become professional children's science podcasters. So I just wanted to start by letting my teammates introduce each other, and I'll, yikes, stop sharing. And why don't you go first, Marshall? Can you talk a little bit about how you got into children's science podcasting in the role you play with Tumble?
It's kind of funny that you're the one asking me that question. My background, unlike I think most people who work in audio, though maybe not for kids, my background's actually in education. That my first job out of college was as a math teacher at a private middle and high school, and I really sort of imagined that that was pretty much going to be my career. I always thought of myself as an educator first and everything else second. So then in 2015, after I had pretty much just finished getting a master's in music education, um, Lindsay came home from work one day and was like, why don't we start a science podcast for kids? And usually, I think the great thing about Lindsay's and my relationship is that we're usually down for whatever the other one wants to do. So I just sort of said, sure, that sounds like fun, and I'll do it, and I'll help, and maybe I'll write the theme. And the theme was actually the first piece of music that I ever made on Logic Pro, which is the software that I use now. Um, and I learned quite a bit about how to use that software just in making the theme, which is still our show's theme. Um, and then after the third or fourth episode, I started doing all of the scoring, or maybe it was the fifth or sixth. I don't remember what it was, but there was a point early on where I was like, do you know what? I'm still playing around with this music creation software, and I'm finding the process fun, and I'm learning a lot about how to use it and how to make music sound good in a home recording setup. And I thought, why don't I just start scoring the episodes or writing original music? Because Lindsay was using um, royalty-free music that she was just downloading and sticking in, and it didn't always quite capture the vibe of what we were going for. So I just thought I could probably do better than that. Um, and it's really been a process of learning. And every episode, I sort of pick out a new thing to try to learn um, for the scoring and also the sound design and all that.
And importantly, you're the co-host is probably how most people
Right.
know you on the podcast.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that. I co-host the show. That was sort of the first proposition is like, will you co-host it? And then I just started volunteering to make all this music for it. And as the show sort of gained an audience, which is something that I honestly found surprising, um, that as it gained an audience, it became really a big part of the show, just my voice as a host, and then also my voice as a composer and a sound designer. So it's really, in some ways, it's kind of intimidating that I'm hanging out at these things with like people who are, amazing composers and people whose work I really admire, and I'm kind of one of them. And that's it's been an amazing journey. As far as like in the company, another thing that I kind of fell into is doing all of our finances and HR and compliance stuff that I didn't even know would become part of my future. But that's the sort of thing I just, we needed someone to start managing our money and looking at what was going in and what was going out, and I was the one who was willing to do it. So that then became my job and how I contribute to our company, mostly outside of the production work.
Yeah, and you also do a lot with education and curriculum as well.
Right.
So
Yeah.
many, many hats is the point I'm making.
Yeah, I mean, I
Um,
would say at the beginning, I didn't really know anything about making a podcast, but I knew a lot about kids, and I still think of myself as an educator first, and most of what I do with our show is education and talking to kids. And my favorite thing in the world, and I wish I got to do it more, is getting out and interacting with our listeners.
Great. And so, Sarah, can you tell me again, this is like me dragging people into doing this podcast, but can you tell me a little bit how you got into it? What's your story?
Hmm. Yeah, well, thank you, Lindsay, for dragging me into kids podcasting. Um, as Lindsay mentioned, it's almost been 10 years now. So my story is that going back to when I was a kid, I've always been really into making videos, doing theater, but I also was really into science and really thought I was going to be a scientist up through college. And it wasn't until I started doing really extensive lab work that I was like, actually, the lab is not my favorite part about science. My favorite part about science is the learning and the reports and the research and the communicating around it. So when I graduated from college, I got into science writing. And then I discovered podcasts as they started to become a thing with, Radiolab and This American Life and all the OG sort of podcasts that really put podcasting on the map. And I ended up going into the Transom Story Workshop, which is a shout out if anyone is interested in another place for great resources on making podcasts, storytelling, gear, all of that. They have such amazing resources online, and I highly recommend it. And I had just the pleasure of living in Woods Hole, Cape Cod, and with Rob Rosenthal and Jay Allison, and meeting Ira Glass and all these people and learning about podcasting. And I was really stoked on it. And I came back to Austin, Texas, and got invited to this group. And I think almost maybe like a week after returning to Austin, I met Lindsay. And we were in a group together called the Austin Listening Lounge, which um, was just such a great support group at the time of people who were producers sharing work that wasn't completely finished or stuff that was finished and they wanted feedback on. And so it really was kind of like a writer's room circle, but for people who were working on totally different projects. And so Lindsay and I got to know each other through that group. And then I became pregnant and she had just had her kid and I was pregnant and she said, now that I have this little kid running around, I'm thinking, what about audio for kids? And I just remember at the time thinking that's something. Like, I was like, that's really such a great idea. And I didn't really think anyone was doing it. And I didn't really know what that was going to look like. And there were like all these questions we had to answer along the way to even convince ourselves that it was a project we wanted to do. But Lindsay's just sort of head for down moving forward on her idea was such a strong pull. And I said, which is, I don't know if anyone has kids, this is sort of mostly laughable if you know about being pregnant, but I thought, well, this will be a fun thing to do on maternity leave while I'm not busy doing anything else. Needless to say, almost, yeah. So my kid's 8, almost 9, and we're still going really strong. And yeah, and my role has really evolved with the show. I would say within Tumble Media in general, I'm an executive producer. I help with show timelines, just sort of general visions for the shows, making sure like all the cogs are moving together so that things can go out. I'm a hands-on editor with the Science Podcast, and work closely with Lindsay on, just getting the storytelling to. Um, we're always pushing ourselves. It's a really great back and forth relationship. On pushing the stories to just grow and grow. Outside of the Science Podcast, I do graphic design. I mean, we all wear a lot of hats. I think that's maybe a theme that will come out of this this webinar. If you start a podcasting company, is you'll probably have a lot of hats that you're wearing. I also do graphic design, web design, and I'm work with partnership organizations. So we work with organizations outside that's who want to get their message out um, through our podcast. So yeah.
Yeah. And you're also the co-principal investigator of the National Science Foundation grant that we're working on. Basically, Sarah keeps things moving in a way that I think no one else could. So I want to get straight into the questions so we have as much time as possible for discussion and to take everybody's questions in the webinar. But let's start with a pre-submitted question, which I thought was really interesting because it's about running an independent kids podcast, which we've been from the beginning and we remain, and there's been a lot of learning along the way. So the question is, what are the advantages and disadvantages to running an independent kids podcast? And did you ever consider stopping being an independent kids podcast?
Yeah, I would say that the advantages and disadvantages of running an independent kids podcast are the same in that you control everything. And then also, disadvantage, you control everything. So I think that, you know, it's lovely to be in charge of like the fate of your brain baby and where you want it to go. And there's a lot of strengths to that, and we're really proud of that. But there's also, I think, all the things you get when you run your own business of, burnout, moments of instability, um, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think I would definitely say the same. I mean, the advantage is that, if you're not an indie, like you're always kind of at someone else's mercy, and you might put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into a show that then they decide there's no audience for, and so they cancel it, or there's no monetization strategy or whatever, and then you're just totally out of luck. And I think that's one really big advantage to being independent, is that no one else decides our fate, and that even when we're struggling to monetize our work, we can keep pushing on if we feel like it's something we're getting value out of. Um, so yeah, I mean, the disadvantage is like, there's not a steady paycheck. You have to hustle for everything you get. And
But but like Marshall's saying, I do think, as the podcast industry ages and as it goes through its like ups and downs, being able to be a small ship that's steering itself, we're able to navigate those waters and turn quickly and do what we need to do to stay afloat. Whereas if we were potentially on a larger ship, we may not have the ability to be so nimble and to make the decisions to keep moving forward. Those decisions would just be made for us, and I think that
Yep.
that can be really, really hard too.
Yeah. And I think what's worth noting is that, we said we've been doing this for 10 years, but the majority, is it the majority or sort of the halfway point now? We were working other jobs. We really did whatever we could to keep the ship afloat. I think in part because we knew that we had something and we knew that the time would come at some point. Maybe it feels like we're still waiting for that time. But I think that we have seen it borne out that there's a lot of recognition that what we do has value, but, and there's also a lot of value in being there from the beginning of a new idea, and it takes a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. But it's been so wonderful to really be in control of things now that we're in a place where, number one, we know what we're doing, and number two, like there's a lot more interest in kids podcast right now. Let's see. We have a question from Chad in the chat, which is, why did we choose to have more than one host on the show? And I guess I can take that. I just thought that there should be a male and female back and forth, I think that it really depends on the show, what kind of voice you want, but I think I was going for a banter, like an exchange of ideas, and especially the way that Marshall and I have it set up is like I'm sort of the teacher and he's the learner. And especially in educational podcasts, like that's a really good way that, one person can deliver the information and the other can be a proxy for the listener. So you can really, play both sides and then have like bring in moments of like levity and change. And that's a really nice part of it.
I'd add to that, Lindsay, from the very early days, I remember we played around with like what that was going to be. And there was even, I think, maybe one episode or two episodes, if you go to the first season, where I'm on the tape,
Yeah.
where you could hear me, and I tried to come in and like be a part of it. And I think part of it was, especially being indie, like what fit into Lindsay and Marshall's lives. They were married, they were in the same house, they were like on the same schedule, so it was like made sense for them to be together. And then also, I think it's about establishing voice for your podcast, and really having that back and forth allows so much of the script to have that cadence and to have like a pattern and a movement to it, that if it was just one person, it'd be a lot harder to carry through like dense topics. And we also just didn't really have the time or the budget to do a lot of like in-field audio. Like we have got some episodes where you can hear some, more ambi audio going on, but for the most part it's, recorded at home. And so that banter provides like a texture for the listeners that's like really accessible, and I thought was like easier to write into in those early versions when we were flipping pancakes, those early pancakes. The ones that stick to the pan, the
where
early
the
pancakes.
pan's just not the right temperature quite yet.
It's not right. It's not flipping yet. They're kind of like
okay. I just got to that metaphor, Sarah.
Sorry.
I was like on a hamburgers thing, and then it was like, what? Early pancakes?
I mean, that's how we funded the show, was flipping hamburgers, but that's a difference.
Sorry.
I know. I was like, did we fund it through pancakes? Yeah, but I think, in terms of what we've talked before about on the webinar, it is about designing for sustainability. So, like if it's you and your house, you can figure out a way to host it on your own. There's a lot, or, have guests in a way like it can work a lot of different ways, but I knew that I had Marshall, and so he was really the only option in some ways. I was just like, I just can't record like after bedtime and have somebody over,
Yeah, that's
besides the
the
person who's
only
already here.
the only VO talent that you could get for free on short notice.
It's true. It worked out though. Um, so Melissa's question is, do you think that having guests is essential for a kids science podcast? And I'll let one of you take that.
I mean,
No. Oh, no, go, you go, Marshall. What's your thought?
well, I was gonna say, I think it's essential for the way we're approaching it. Because I think like you know, like the real mission behind our show is that we want to talk about science as a process and we want to talk about scientists as humans. And I don't think you could do that without having a human scientist on talking about their work. Um, so I think for that process, I think you need to have a scientist involved. Um,
Yeah.
100%.
yeah.
But there are lots of examples where there aren't guests on science podcasts. So there's one that currently our 4-year-old is really enjoying that's just like fully sound design and does a really good job of bringing science through the narration and the action that you can hear. It's called Dino Dome. It's from the Australian Broadcast Corporation. And I've been listening to nothing but that in the car for a while. And I really appreciate, how it really brings science in without the scientists, and it has a lot of action. So it really just depends on, what your idea is and how you pull it off.
I will say, I agree 100% with what Lindsay and Marshall are saying, and that if you don't, for us, it was about amplifying voices. So, like, having the actual voice of the scientists and making them people was a big part of our show. If you were doing a show that wasn't about that, I would say one of the other advantages is that we get to get the scientists to help check, like we do fact checking, but also have them check our fact checking with some of the more complicated science. And I think if you're not working with a scientist and you are writing, you want to make sure you've got some really great research and some really good fact checking happening, because once you start telling the science, just be confident. You want to be confident that you're saying the right thing, and having the scientists come straight from their mouths is makes it a lot easier to get that correct.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to go back to another pre-submitted question that was really interesting about revenue and sort of branching out from the kids podcast scene. Um, it seems like there's a big push these days to make kids podcasts into brands with merch, books, educational materials, and other activities. What are the challenges associated with branching out from the original audio format? And do you worry that the show starts to take a back seat to the more profitable endeavors after a while? So that's really thinking like high level about how are you supporting your podcast, and a lot of other things can come into it. So, Sarah and Marshall, what do you think?
Um,
Do you want to talk
sorry, do
about
you want?
education materials,
Yeah,
Marshall? Because I would say that's our only really big thing that I think we spend a lot of time on outside of the show.
yeah. I mean, I can say, one thing with education materials is I think, like, I see a lot of podcasts, particularly for kids, kind of being like, we've got education stuff, we've got activities. Um, the difficulty is, if you're going to go that route, you really need to understand what teachers are looking for and what makes something a viable activity for the classroom. Because I think something that a lot of non-educators don't know or understand is how much um, a teacher is, on any given day, a teacher is looking for a very specific thing that really fits with their curriculum and with what they're trying to teach. And what they're trying to teach is usually state mandated or mandated by some other thing. So you really want to make sure that what you're providing fits. And I think most people who make educational materials aren't really thinking about that. So yeah, I mean, that's just like one very specific, case of that question. But I think it's really easy to do those things as kind of like a tack on. And I think that applies to everything like TV or whatever else you want to do. Like, oh, we're going to do a YouTube channel and like have some AI cartoons where they're like, you know, um, but like you don't, if you don't put as much work into those as you do the show, they're not really going to be a good monetization stream for you. They're not going to be more profitable than your main show. So then, I don't know.
Yeah, I would say that is the part for me. Like, I'm not convinced that these extra legs to the brand are necessarily profitable. And um, you know, for us and our show, they are never, our show never takes a back seat to making these like extra things. If we were getting a ton of money and being able to fund, more episodes because we were making these extra things, and I think we would maybe invest more in that. But really, it's something we do because we believe in these materials and we want to provide resources for the teachers. And so we're doing it with like a purpose. We're not just like, I mean, we do have a merch store, but again, like that was a pretty low lift, and we intentionally did the merch store as a low lift because it doesn't bring in, enough money to like fund, fund the show or anything. So I wouldn't look at that as the silver bullet of like, how do I make money doing the podcast, sell t-shirts and coloring books or something. It's not gonna do it.
Yeah, I think the idea is that those are more monetizable immediately than the podcast. It's like you can sell ads on the podcast, but that's a volatile market versus having a product that's associated with it. And that's still like I can see the question writer's idea of like it sort of takes your, eye off the prize, but for everybody, it's different. A podcast, for a lot of people, might be a route to get to those things that they want to do. I know kids podcasters like, I want to write books. I'm going to make it in a podcast and then I'm going to get a book deal. And so everybody has a different route. But if you are prior to if like the podcast is the thing for you, you want to make the podcast and the podcast is the end goal, um, you know, y- you can keep focusing on how to fund that podcast out of instead of like how to pour resources into other materials. And okay, next question. I think this is kind of related on the revenue question. What's been our most profitable income source as an indie show? Um, and I think it might be just a good idea to kind of like lay out what are, a few different revenue sources for an indie show that you can consider having. Marshall, do you want to take that as the finances person?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. So our biggest revenue streams right now are grant funding. Advertising is up there as well. Um, and then Patreon and crowdfunding support, subscriptions, things like that are um, also like they make up a smaller chunk. And then after that is all the other things that are little. Um, like merch sales, yada yada yada. Um, I would say in terms of what's most profitable, I I don't know. It's hard to say. I think that the overall lesson is it's, money when it comes to monetization, it's diversity is I think really key, and that just being open to lots of different things. There's also like licensing stuff we do with some of our content that brings in some revenue. And there's just a lot of different things, and um, that's really the most important piece. I hope that's an answer to the question.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest lessons we've learned in that the main product of what we want to do is free. You know, to listeners, it's free, and the ad market is so, sort of up and down and still evolving. So just the more that you can think of creative ways that your individual podcast might find support, might find a niche where you can make a bit of money. Our goal is always really to focus on what we're doing and what we've made and what is the valuable content and figure out how to monetize that and just be innovative because as we've mentioned many times in the webinar, like we're really just at the beginning and we just need to experiment as much as we can as an industry to find a business model that's supportive. So we're really still in a point of exploration, both as a company and as a total industry. So any idea, or even if you're not sure if it's a genius idea, try it out and just see what works and throw a lot of things at the wall as you go.
Mhm. And if we have a moment, I was just going to talk about, like, Marshall mentioned grants, and I think that we get people asking us about that. We're a very mission-driven show, so nonprofit funding is like a really good match for what we want to do and like our goals for what the show is. And I think with grants, you know, we have everything from small little community cultural arts grants that are only a couple $100 to large, $1 million, government grants. So, which are not all coming to us this
Yeah,
year, but
let's be
a
really
bunch of
clear
people.
about
Let's
that.
be
We're
very
not
clear
getting
that
a
we're
million
not
dollars.
$1
Yeah.
million or whatever. But it's a big project, right? And it took a lot to apply for those. So that can be really overwhelming, I think, to people as like, if you're start looking at grants and thinking about grants, there's places in between, really tiny little amounts of funding to big funding, and finding something that fits the mission of what your show is. And I think that that's really what it's about, is finding sources of funding that want to make what you're doing and like want to amplify that.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, There is a specific grants question, which is, are grants a reliable way to find funding for a kids' science podcast?
I mean, I laugh because I just like I don't think there's anything that's reliable with finances ever. I guess that's just me. That's my personal opinion. So I really would never want to tell you or sell you on like something's like a reliable way. But I will say what's nice about grants and like really speaks to like my control issues is the like long tail on it. Is like it's stable. Like you get a grant and you have funding for a year or 3 years or whatever, and you're like, okay, that's a runway. Like you just can't know that with advertising ever or anything else that's more like this. So I think for me, it's always really nice to have, if you can get that reliable funding. It's reliable once you get it. It's hard to get it. But once you can get it, it creates that baseline. And like that's been really huge for us as a team and as a show.
Yeah. I mean, I think, the overall thing with grants and really like anything is there's no such thing as free money. And
Hmm.
if you know, every grant we apply for is extremely competitive, and you've got to have a really strong, compelling project. And there's a ton of work that goes into even just submitting an application. And uh, that in the world of grants, as I've learned, there's, they estimate a 10% chance of any one particular proposal succeeding. Um, so a lot of the big organizations that rely on grant funding tend to just be constantly submitting stuff. And oftentimes, they'll submit the same project to the same funder several times and not get a thumbs up on it until the fourth or fifth submission. So it's really,
Yeah.
there's no magic bullet to just automatically be able to do something for free without having to super hustle and and work for it. But I think, like Sarah said, once you get in, if you do get any grant funded, then that is reliable funding once it's there.
Yeah, they're gonna pay it. Um,
Yeah.
I think that the other thing is that you just have to be persistent. There's just because things are competitive and a lot of people are going for it doesn't mean that you shouldn't. And keep going and try again and don't throw the baby out with the bathwater once you've submitted, because there's still something to that idea. You don't need to reinvent a podcast to make it work. It's just really understanding what the funders want and what they need to hear.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, there
it's
was
Okay.
one partner on a proposal we worked on together said something like, any grant proposal is a win if you get feedback from the funder, whether you
mhm.
get accepted or not. So
And just keep trying, I think would be my answer to that too. Like our first grant, we really like you know, uh, aimed really high and fell like really far on our first grant application. It was really
I'm
intense.
still processing.
It was, yeah, there were tears, like it was a thing, but we didn't stop. It was like we agreed, like, okay, we didn't do this, but we learned so much along the way. And I would think it's like when you first start out pitching or whatever you're doing where you're trying to get into like an industry, like grants are its own little climate and they have ways of talking about stuff and there's things to read into the submission, calls for proposals and things like that, that the more you do it and the more you look at it, the more you start to see those things, and I think the better the chances become. So it's also like if it seems really intimidating, I would not take that personally. I think it just is intimidating. Like grants are intimidating to the people who do them all the time, and it's just like keep trying, and if you're interested in that, you should just keep looking at it.
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. We have a question from attendee here. It says, you said you've been making Tumble for almost 10 years. How do you keep track of what topics you've already covered and what experts you've spoken to? Do you recover content or re-interview guests ever? Sarah, do you want to take that?
Let's see if you want to take it. I would say we do have a catalog of all of our episodes. And we know like what we've covered. I think largely I'm rely on the Rolodex that is Lindsay's brain, because she seems to remember every person we've talked to in this way that I find very impressive. And we do recover topics, but not usually like the exact same topic. We've had a couple guests who've come on more than once. If somebody's a really good talker, like we'll bring them back. Um, and then sometimes we'll replay episodes in the feed as like a rebroadcast. That's like the exact same episode picked up. But I don't know, Lindsay, do you want to talk about like managing the topics and how you keep that all in your head in terms of the guests?
Yeah, I mean, because I think it's easy because I talk to people and I remember everybody that I've talked to and like worked with their voices and with their scripts. It's hard to forget just who I've talked to. But I think one of the things is that over time, as we've gotten feedback from listeners, we learn what topics are popular with our audience and what they want to hear more of. We want to do things different ways every single time. So for example, if we've done a whole, sorry, and my words are getting confused, but if we've done an episode on a black hole and we keep getting more questions about black holes, it's not like, oh, black holes are done. Like the
Mhm.
science is still evolving. Like it's been, we kind of try to space things out in a certain way that feels like, oh, it's not a million episodes about black holes or a million episodes about dinosaurs. We have sort of a natural cadence, but we'll, you know, talk to people that were really fantastic again, if they have new research or we are looking for an answer to a question and we just want to talk to somebody that we know is going to be fantastic, we'll go back and re-interview people. But we always can kind of find new angles on things because even if it sort of like fits into a category, there's a zillion stories to tell about it. So, yeah, it's really fun to just be able to go deeper each time.
And when it comes to how we keep track of them, we have a spreadsheet. And that's for those of us
We
who
did
are,
eventually go, yeah. I
yeah,
think we went through and like sort of metadata tagged everything, and then you can do some fun things to figure out how much you've covered and what your gender distribution of scientists is and things like that.
yeah, we did do all that, and also like kept track of which topics seemed to resonate more with our audience.
Yeah. And Marshall, can you speak a little bit about how you do sound design for each show? Like what are your main considerations when you have, a rough cut that you need to work with? What would your advice be?
Oh gosh, I wish I had more of like a concrete process, but it's sort of like, you know, whenever I'm listening to a rough cut with no sound, I think about how that section needs to feel. Like what is the emotion behind it? Like, is this excitement? Is it mystery? Is it curiosity? Is it a kind of like awe-inspiring wonder? Is there some fear in there? Like, is it silly, which is what it is most of the time? Um, and kind of like I always try to have those vibes, or start from that kind of emotional core and then work up from there. A lot of the times also I like to include some sort of sound from the science if I can into the music. Somewhere in year 2 or 3, I got really into using samplers. So for if I ever can, I always reach out to the scientist and just like, do you have any recordings of your work? If you use a machine, can you send me a recording of it? Or like, can you send me a video of you in your lab or something like that? And I'm looking for some sort of like sound that's essential to the topic we're talking about. And I try to incorporate that into the music as well. So some combination of like, what's the emotion that we're really going for? And also like what's some sound that I can incorporate into or sound from the science that I can incorporate into the music in some way. And in some ways it's really easy because there's like the scientist is studying an animal and I just have to find out what that animal sounds like. And I'm always surprised because animals sound way crazier than you think.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah.
Cows, they sound exactly how you think they're gonna sound, though. Okay, Jackie asks, is there a recommended way to have kids participate, whether it's recording or something else?
Yeah, well, I mean, we ask kids to participate through recording questions, and that's been really great. Uh, for us, I think it really anchored the show early on to have the kids' questions and like their curiosity help guide, um, the direction of like what the episode is going to be. And sometimes, this is, the behind the scenes information. Like we will have a question or a topic that we just really want to cover. And then we'll engage with our audience by asking our Patreon members to submit questions around that topic. So we can sometimes kind of lead them into an area. We ask for voice recordings over email. But we also have release forms. I just want to say, everyone, if you're going to engage with kids on your show, you just know the rules and know the laws, and I'm not a lawyer, so please ask your lawyer or look it up. But we do all of that to make sure that we're gathering the information and talking to the kids in a very legal way.
Yeah, I think, listen to a lot of kids' podcasts and just hear different ways that you hear kids' voices in it, whether they're professional kids' voices, whether it's listeners, whether it's, co-hosts, kids making the podcast themselves. So there's a lot of good examples out there, and, you can think of new ways as well.
I do want to call
Um,
one example. It's not a science podcast, but Grim Grimmer Grimmest with is it Adam Gidwitz, who's the host of that show?
Kidwits, yeah.
He does an incredible job of engaging with kids on that show. I think, part of it is he has hand selected kids that he has, that he can vibe with really well, but he does a great job with it. And if you want some like expert kid engagement, give that show a listen.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's really good. And it really, I think having the kids on the show really, you know, give some perspective as to, I think for like a scary show, or, we're talking about a science show, just showing how like smart kids are and showing how wild their ideas are, and just having a lot of fun with it. Okay, we're about out of time here, so I just want to ask our panelists if there's anything that they want to mention that you didn't get questions about, like if you were to, convey a few parting pieces of advice to our audience, what would they be? Who should I put on the spot first here? I'm gonna choose Marshall again.
Okay. I mean, I think one thing, I don't know, I just as a music guy, I would say, there's lots of tricks of the trade when it comes to using scoring in your show that I think um, aren't necessarily obvious right off the bat. And sort of, I think it is important if you're going to have music in there to think of music as being sort of another character in the show, or think of the characters as being musical in a way. And I could probably go on about that much longer than would be appropriate. But if anyone has any questions about that, I can definitely chime in.
Sarah, what do you think?
Ooh, I think I would just say that if you're thinking about creating a podcast, have a really strong sense of a why. Like, it's not like, oh, I'm just gonna, I mean, you can just make a podcast, I guess, but like, know why you're trying to do that. If it's you're trying to play around, you want to be in a different medium, are you trying to build an audience, are you trying to answer a specific question, like what's your why for doing your show? And I think that that really is really sustained us throughout the years, is knowing like why we're doing our show, um and always coming back to that. And I really think people should do that, because sometimes I think podcasts are a bright and shiny object to a lot of people, as something they just like want to try. Um, and that's fine. But if you're really trying to build something, you've got to have some passion and some direction. And then I'd say also, like, what is your own measurement of success? I think the ecosystem's just really difficult right now. And I think it's hard for shows to just like take off like they maybe used to. Um, and so know that as you're going into it. Like, how are you measuring success for yourself? What do you need to happen to your show to make it enough for you to keep going? Um, so that you can have that perspective once you're on the journey. Because I think if you go into it and you're not immediately getting, 10,000 plus downloads or whatever, I think it's easy to be discouraged. But I think if you're getting even 50 people listening, and those are the people you want listening, maybe that's enough. Like I don't know. It just depends on what you're trying to do with your show.
Yeah, that's really, really good advice, that, no one's going to come down and say, you need to get this many listens to be successful. The best thing is to set your own benchmarks. And, ours really was, being able to work in this company full time. And it felt like a far off dream that was like sort of the ultimate goal, which like hung in the air, seemed impossible, but we got there. And, now we sort of continue to kind of figure out where the direction is and evaluate constantly. So I think that that's something that everybody can do is sort of reevaluate what your measures of success are. Well, thank you so much for joining me, and it's been nice to talk to other people on a webinar. And thank you everyone so much for your questions. Obviously, we could go on talking about science podcasts for kids forever, and it feels momentous that we have come to the end of this 4-part series. But I just want to end with the format that I've chosen, which is the mindset question. So let me share my screen again and get over there. Um, so now that we've, if you've watched the whole thing, it's been 4 hours of content. You're very committed and invested in this. So thank you so much. But how do you like keep going and take all that you've learned to actually make a science podcast for kids? So my mindset question to end on is, what's your next step? Go ahead and make a list to make things concrete. What did you learn here that you need to know more about? What did you learn that you think that you can start on right now? Is it finding partners? Is it developing your idea more? Is it getting the technical training that you need to fulfill some of those roles and getting your pilot off the ground? Um, just make a list, but also make it manageable and give yourself enough time. Remember, you're probably the one, unless you work at a deadline-driven institution that wants you to make a podcast by, Q1, it's, your timeline and it's up to you, and pilots take a very, very long time to get off the ground. So just make it however you can and keep going. And it has been a pleasure to be able to spend time with people, whether you've been here in person, virtually, or on YouTube. You can reach out to us if you want to follow up on any of the things or potentially work with us. We're hello@Tumble Media, and we do a lot of different things and would love to hear from you, even just if you have comments on what you learned in the class and how the class was structured. We'd love to hear feedback or what you'd like to do more now that you've gotten to the end. And I also want to thank the guests today and all of the guests who have joined me over the past 4 sessions. And a very, very special thanks to the National Association of Science Writers, whose grant was the spark for this idea, and also the realization that there just weren't resources out there like this, and that this is something that was potentially needed and hopefully helped people. So again, thank you so much for joining us. And I want to say we'll see you next time, but write in the comments below uh, what you want to do with this. So thanks so much, and it's been great. Bye, everyone.
Bye.